Hello and welcome to this video episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a staff research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the institution and your host for this episode. And I'm joined by Shobhankita Reddy, my colleague from the High-Tech Geopolitics program, who also does a regular deep dive on China tech as part of our bi-weekly newsletter, Technopolitic. Welcome to the episode, Shobhankita.
Thank you, Anushka.
So I thought today we could have a conversation about understanding China's tech ecosystem, especially considering you follow it on a regular basis, and also given the fact that there have been a lot of policy and innovation related developments in China's science and tech ecosystem in the past couple months and years, which have kind of disrupted the debate around some of these critical and emerging technologies, right? We talk about artificial intelligence, quantum developments in even nuclear fusion. We see China making some strides. And of course, Deepseek is just the latest leg of some of these discussions surrounding whether China can indeed catch up to the prowess of the United States when it comes to tech, right? And the fact that technology geopolitics today is at the center of the contention between US and China is actually a factor of geopolitics that is here to stay and far precedes Trump's second presidency and maybe since Trump 1.0 all the way to Biden and now Trump 2.0, we're seeing this policy consistency where restricting or hindering China's rise as a tech power has become a central feature of geopolitical debates. And so I thought in this context, we could just have a conversation today to understand what China's tech ecosystem looks like today, what recent policy and innovation or systems related developments our listeners should maybe know about from you, and maybe some brief insights towards the end on where is the ecosystem going, right? And I thought we could start by talking about China's bustling private sector industry, maybe not so bustling in the context of the fact that there have been a bunch of restrictions and policy practices that have kind of impeded business sentiment, but at the same time we see all of these innovative developments coming up, and I get the sense that there is still some hope for the private sector enterprises in China. So Shubhankita, with that, let me come to you and maybe pose my first query. Could you lay out a little bit of context for our listeners on what the developments in China's science and tech private sector have been like in the past few years? You could maybe talk about what government-private relations have been, and at the same time maybe then focus on some of the more recent developments, such as a private tech sector symposium that took place which Xi Jinping led. And a lot of folks speculated, including yourself, that this of course has a symbolic value in the sense that it's kind of supposed to be an image similar to Trump being surrounded by all of these tech billionaires at his inauguration, and this symposium in China was took place exactly about a month ago. So maybe some of your thoughts leading up to this symposium and what were the key insights you got from this event. Over to you, Shubhankita.
Yeah, thank you. So just to kind of set the context, right? Starting 2021, there was a tech crackdown by the government on private sector in China. This affected e-commerce, edtech, hedge funds, a bunch of companies that focus on consumer technology, particularly from the private sector in China. And, Jack Ma really was the public face for some of this because it kind of started after his controversial speech about financial regulations in China. And then the IPO of one of the companies that was affiliated to the Alibaba group was kind of stalled. And if it would have gone through, that would have been the largest IPO in the world. Right. And, the private sector crackdown that started in 2021 was really almost systemic after a point in time because it targeted monopolies, it targeted regulatory overhauls, they made different changes for data security and privacy requirements. It was a whole bunch of things. And really, billions of dollars of market cap really disappeared from the Chinese markets overnight. Right? So there was quite a bit of tension about the state of private sector in China. But not to say that these companies were not doing well. I mean, I think one of the problems, at least for the CCP, was that they were doing really, really well. Right, they were so large so as to kind of be an upfront for the Chinese state. Some of these leaders had become too big. Their public following was too large, and so I think some of this was also ideological in that sense.
Yeah, I mean the CPC has always had a problem with alternative centers of power.
Correct. Yes, and at the same time, Xi Jinping particularly has held a very dismissive view of consumer tech. He's called them spiritual opium. Harking back to the opium wars that China had to face many decades ago. So there's been a contention as to all these tech that's really wasting people's time, taking away people's bandwidth. It's not really helpful to hard industrial policies that then eventually add up to national power. So I think that was kind of the contention that led these crackdowns to happen. And so there's been kind of a difficult time for China since, at least as far as the stock markets, as well as foreign direct investments, as well as just the trust in the Chinese economy since, right? I mean, of course, we've also had the property sector, unemployment growth, COVID obviously was a very difficult time. So there's been a lot of things since then. And a lot has changed for the private sector pre-2021 and now. But today what we see is some kind of warming up, I think, to the private sector. So there's been a bunch of things recently which indicate to this. For example, the Spring Lunar Festival that happened pretty much, the eve of the Lunar Festival, the Spring Festival Gala, which happens the eve of the Lunar New Year. That really was a public celebration of some of these private tech, because Unitary, for example, which is a robotics company, had humanoid robots, in colorful, attire, kind of dancing and coordinating to humans on stage. And this is really this is really China's Super Bowl in some sense, right? Because it's a hugely televised show. It's the single most, it's got a Guinness World Record for the number of viewers that tune in for this. So it's huge, and it had, say, a private sector robotics company, mixing technology as well as culture on stage. And again, there has been indication since, I think, the last 1 year that arbitrary fines, investigations, and regulatory crackdowns on private tech would need to change, right? I mean, that there would need to be more stability in light of the declining economy and unemployment, and obviously it's private sector that employs a lot more people than the public sector. So in light of that, there needs to be more smooth regulation for the private sector. So there's been some kind of sense for that. I think there's also been Deepseek, which kind of really changed the public sentiment in some way, right? For example, there's a lot of talk in Chinese social media about national destiny and about how China has had a century of humiliation, and they've been on the path to national rejuvenation and pretty much since. And Deepseek, in some sense, in the popular parlance, is one way of kind of, rising up and, being globally recognized for your technology investments, right? So really, in China, there's a very high interlink between technology and national power, and you see this percolating to the consumer base as well. So in this context, the particular conversation and the high-level symposium that Xi Jinping had with private sector entrepreneurs is really timely, right? I mean, of course, yes, there is the symbolic importance, because Trump at his inauguration was flanked by a bunch of tech billionaires. And this is Xi Jinping's sort of response to that in some ways, what people are saying. But it's also important to note that the last time the symposium took place was in 2018, when, before these regulatory crackdowns on tech in 2021 had happened. And at that time as well, it seemed like it was Xi Jinping reaching out to the private sector in response to Trump's trade war, because this was Trump 1.2 and Trump had started the trade war then. So this seems to be a second innings of that, because again, in the first few months of Trump's term now, he's been talking about increasing threats of tariffs on Chinese goods.
Yeah.
So this seems like, again, Xi Jinping's kind of reach out to the private sector to call that they kind of mobilize themselves to focus on real economy again, prosperity of the people, the Chinese economy, and so on and so forth.
Right.
Jack Ma was there at this meeting, which is very newsworthy because he was, again, like I said, the public face of the previous crackdown, and so his reinstallation in some sense in public life and in such a grand way is again very, very symbolic.
Yeah.
But what's important to note is that there's a nuance here, which is that it doesn't look like Xi Jinping's views on consumer tech being kind of spiritual opium and really a waste of people's time, but they are one way to kind of let loose and have your entertainment in place. That doesn't seem to have changed, right? Yeah. Because if you look at the speakers at the symposium, if you look at Xi Jinping's words and what he really spoke of, and if you look at his speeches, all of that seemed to say, we understand that there is regulatory trouble and we're going to try and work for a smoother regulatory environment for you all, which again, for the last 1 year has been kind of going on. And again, what he seems to say is, you need to kind of double down on your measures for the Chinese economy, and it's his reach out in that regard. So unless supplemented by key policy changes in the coming months, it doesn't particularly look like his stance for consumer tech has changed. But regardless, given the broader domestic economy, the unemployment rate, the need for private sector to kind of fill in the gap, because again, and I'm sure we'll come to this, but state-owned enterprises have really been full of corruption and mismanagement and so on, right? So really, the engine for growth and innovation in China, to the most part, has been led by the private sector. So to that regard, I think there is that nuanced tension and tussle, but just in the context of everything else that's been going on, which is Deepseek, Huawei also being able to kind of circumvent some of the export controls placed by the US on it, in terms of just the broader unitary on stage at the Spring Festival gala, a year after all of this has been kind of in the public parlance that, private sector regulation is going to go through some kind of overhaul. I think this particular meeting was very, very timely.
Yeah. Interesting, Shobhankita. Last points first. As you rightly pointed out, I think this deliberation surrounding the easing of the crackdown against the private sector has been around for a while, and we also had a private businesses symposium side by side in the past few weeks, and even there the sentiment seemed to be that there is going to be some capital infusion to renew and revitalize business sentiment. But at the same time, as you also highlighted, a bunch of economic problems coupled with the fact that there is just no easing on the consumerism side of things really makes it difficult to bring investment sentiment and the sentiment to spend money back to normal, right? Which is also why we regularly argue at Takshashila that China is never going to see the 9%, 10% growth digits that it did maybe under Hu Jintao, right? Yeah. And this also brings up a very interesting dilemma in the Chinese science and tech ecosystem, to my perspective, which is that on the one hand, you want to focus on alleviating some of your macroeconomic tensions in general by shifting the growth engine of the economy from export-oriented stuff to consumer-oriented stuff. But on the other hand, in tech, you continue to see this, what Xi Jinping refers to as the balancing of development and security, which can have its own consequences for a thriving innovation ecosystem, for commercialization to thrive, right? Especially because technologies that once experiment with a large consumer base commercialize and export faster. So I think there are these intractable dilemmas that really put the tech domain, the tech industry in specific, and the larger economy in general in a bind. But if I can maybe talk a little bit about this idea of guiding the private sector, there was another meeting that happened in early March, which was the 2 sessions, right? It's an annual meeting. Some would say it's a meeting of the rubber stamp parliament and the rubber stamp consultative process. But especially at the National People's Congress, there was the announcement of of a venture capital guidance fund, National Venture Capital Guidance Fund, and I don't understand the details exactly, but it's supposed to be 1 trillion yuan invested in long-term and hard technologies, and there's supposed to be some state guidance towards that front. So Shubhankita, could you tell our listeners a little bit about what you gathered from that?
Yeah. So guidance funds in China are a key financial instrument, right? I mean, we have to understand that China is a statist, top-down kind of a control when it comes to technology, right? I mean, not just technology, but of course everything else, but even in technology. And the Chinese government actually has a very national powers view of technology, right? That technology is a very, very key pillar when it comes to a nation's national power, national security, economic growth, as well as military modernization, and, you know, not to mention generally the prosperity of its citizens. So technology is a very, very key pillar. So obviously the Chinese state is very involved there. So coming to the guidance funds, it's one way of mobilizing large quantums of capital for strategic objectives as set by the central government, right? So there are tons of these guidance funds. I think the last number I remember is something around 1,800. And these are across levels of the government, not necessarily just central, but also provincial and local. So we have different guidance funds, and many of them are focused on, again, you know, strategic objectives. So focused on hard technologies, biotechnology, AI, so on and so forth, right? So this is a key financial instrument for the government. And in terms of just how they are run, you know, again, talking about government bureaucracy, there is a lot of mismanagement there, which is the fact that a lot of people who staff these funds are government bureaucrats who are not necessarily venture capitalists in their mindset. They might not understand the technology per se. And when there's just so much money coming in because the government and the central government particularly wants to, you know, channel and direct a particular industry and sector to grow, you know, there might not be that many quality companies or even opportunity for these companies to grow in a particular province. And yet, you know, we see these examples of multiple provinces sort of trying to build pharma and biotech clusters when really there is not much talent and so on in that, right? And these funds were typically focused on early stage companies so that they have a longer horizon and so on and so forth. But again, guidance funds have been mismanaged. Many of them have then focused on late stage investments. Many of them have focused on infrastructure and not necessarily for technology, R&D per se. So there's been a bunch of problems with guidance funds, particularly in China, right? But despite that, I think it's a key financial instrument, and there have been several regulatory frameworks to kind of, you know, solve these issues. But regardless, you know, particularly this 1 trillion yuan kind of a fund, whether or not China is able to kind of mobilize this money. And this is usually going to be, you know, guidance funds typically are mobilized through both public and private. So it's multiple stakeholders as well as the government. So this is also other state-owned enterprises that invest into the guidance funds and so on, right? So this money focused on long-term, and, you know, the announcement actually says 20 years, which is a long time, right? Because venture capital timelines are not more than 10 to 12 years. And so this is pretty much double that. So being able to mobilize this kind of money, we'll have to see how effective it will be. But again, in the context of reducing FDIs in the government, in the Chinese economy, you know, just a declining economy, it makes sense why the government would want to do something like this, right? I mean, put in perspective to that, it kind of makes sense why this idea would have even been floated. But what's important is that because there is, you know, this kind of a regulatory tension as to we don't necessarily know which sector is going to be cracked down next by the government, and if at all, which one and so on. I think guidance funds are also important because they tell you where the Chinese government is committing itself to, right? Because private money and hybrid money can then follow the investments and sectors that these guidance funds kind of then invest in. So in some sense, it's direction setting in that regard as well.
No, that's again a very interesting point, and especially considering in China, at least politically, given the fact that so many bureaucratic cadres swamp some of these important technical kind of groupings. One of the ways the political system in China functions is that promotions of cadres and political leaders, especially at the local and provincial levels, happens based on how successfully they implement some of these central guidances in, say, the development of tech, and some of this can then, for example, manifest in the form of what you were talking about, which is the building of big bio and pharma clusters, right? Even though there may be a lot of competition and no demand, and you see this manifest in terms of renewable technology as well, where private sector firms are attempting to establish a bunch of these solar, hydro, and wind power plants, even though the demand for renewable technology is much less than one would kind of want it to be. And so I guess in that sense, it's interesting, and this is exactly what you pointed out as well, that guidance funds will tell not just domestic entrepreneurs but also entrepreneurs abroad what the Chinese government wants to focus on and really try and develop an edge in, and then that influences policy. And when the risk runway or the timeline is something as long as 20 years, you also know that China wants to play the long game in becoming a tech power, and put tech at the center of its comprehensive national power strategy. But Shobhankita, if I can come back to a point that you made earlier, which was about state-owned enterprises, right? We've discussed how private sector firms are really the engine of economic growth in a lot of ways. What then are the state-owned enterprises up to? We know that there are major SOEs that are giants in the tech domain, and they may have their own advantages to the party state. They may pose their own advantages to the party state and the people, but like you said, mismanagement, corruption, the fact that some of these big SOEs are bleeding money are all again facts of life. So what do you make of maybe the economic trajectory of the SOEs in the past couple years? Are they serving some of their purposes, especially in the tech domain, and what can we expect maybe going forward?
Yeah. So state-owned enterprises have been, again, key government policy for many decades, right? I mean, this is equivalent to India's PSUs, which is our public sector undertakings, right? So it's pretty much the same. But if you look at China, there's been just so much overcapacity, increasing subsidies, infusing of capital into these state-owned enterprises that after a point they've just become inefficient, right? I mean, just the amount of money that some of these companies get. So again, it's because there's so much money coming in that some of this mismanagement, corruption, and so on even flows, right? But talking about the objectives that these state-owned enterprises sort of solve for the government, and I would argue that maybe it's not even technology advancement, which is their primary kind of objective, right? I mean, the problem with state-owned enterprises is that they are solving for multiple objectives which are not necessarily market-oriented, which might be the singular objective for private-owned enterprises. Right, so they're not necessarily just trying to solve for market incentives, they're also trying to solve for the government's need to control key sectors in the economy. They are solving for the government's need to sort of direct capital to things that maybe the private sector is not willing to, because it's got increased timelines and increased capital expenditures and so on, right? So the state-owned enterprises are key instruments in that regard. Also, in China's case particularly, it's also ideological, right? I mean, going back to communist theory, it's also a way for kind of the government to maintain control to key aspects of people's lives. Also, there's this theory of social enterprise, which is that the purpose of these firms is also to maintain social harmony, to, kind of absorb unemployment if it gets too bad. And, these were traditionally what they were used for. For example, when China opened up and there was a whole bunch of private sector factories, Chinese governments, state-owned enterprises still continue to absorb people who otherwise would have not gotten a job in other places, or, would have been too old or whatever else, right? So there's been multiple levers that these firms kind of solve for government state-owned enterprises. But having said that, I think we need a more nuanced approach to what we even define as state-owned enterprises, because it's not necessarily 100% Chinese state-owned. In fact, there are a bunch of companies that are more hybrid in nature, where the Chinese state, through multiple other subsidiaries, like for example, the Chinese government's local province can be a small investor in what is otherwise a private company, right? So there are different instruments where you have increased equity by the Chinese state in what otherwise might even be called privately owned enterprises, right? So there is just that increasing foothold of the Chinese state in multiple sectors, in privately owned, in hybrid, as well as obviously the PSUs, right? The state-owned enterprises. So there is increased government control. I almost think of this as the government's tentacles kind of reaching out and being able to control and have says in different kinds of enterprises, whether or not they're 100% government owned. So I think it's more nuanced, right? I mean, there's multiple objectives these firms are looking to solve, and of course there is this problem of bureaucracy, corruption, and so on, which is why we keep seeing so many cases of revamping, reforms, and so on. But the stock market, obviously, despite government control, rates them, gives them a very low premium as compared to privately owned enterprises.
Right, interesting. I guess that could have to do with the fact that with SOEs, I think there is some assured level of government support, which could potentially be a sign of security in a country like China for stock markets. But I think the big ticket question when it comes to SOEs and subsidies is also the efficiency of the financing of local governments, right? Because of the 4 budgets that local governments maintain, one of them is strictly directed towards enabling enabling these enterprises to perform well, and local governments to earn their premiums from land sales revenues to some of these firms, and then this becomes a whole vicious cycle of the local government supporting the SOEs and vice versa. And so in that sense, really the burden of subsidizing these firms is not on the central government, even though there will be a lot of regulation and guidance. It really falls on local government. So I think one of the ways in which corruption or mismanagement of SOEs must also be solved is by striking a balance between the need for local governments to spend and power the second largest economy in the world, and for them to solve some of their debt mismanagement and off-the-book debt-related issues, and induce some sense of investment confidence in the country.
In the tech domain, I think particularly for generally Chinese enterprises, right? The role of these subsidies has led to what we might call the overcapacity problem, right? Because there's so much money infused on the supply side that it's just led to overcapacity, and much of this is now being exported. So, for example, particularly in electric vehicles, battery components, solar panels, 60 to 90% of the global capacity is now coming through China. And much of this is being powered by some of these instruments and subsidies by the Chinese state, right? So there is definitely this dumping of this into the global economy, but also consumers globally have benefited from low prices because technically all of these products are quite good, right? I mean, there was a time that most Chinese products were looked upon as rip-offs and low quality and so on. But China has come a long way from that, and that was the journey that China took from there to where it is now in high tech. So particularly in some of these technologies, cheap prices, quite good, as opposed to maybe Western origin, extremely good, but also extremely costly. That really is the trade-off. So it's caused sort of the overcapacity problem really for the world, arising from some of these Chinese supply side issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is something a lot of us argue at Takshashila. Overcapacity is real, the dumping is real, and that should be a conversation of its own as to how to bring about solutions to some of that, or how can countries' economic policies be shaped to deal with some of that, given that it's not just about market flooding, it's also about a certain quality that comes with those products at affordable costs, which is also why it's very important for us to actually be able to think about decoupling in a very real way. But more of that maybe in another conversation. Shobhankita, I wanted your thoughts on maybe 2 final queries that I'm thinking about. And the first one pertains to Deepseek, right? You talked about how there is Deepseek, right? That's a paraphrase of how you articulated it, and it really is the case, right? Because DeepSeek came about the most recent version, and it was really disruptive in the sense that there were a lot of questions about how China has been able to do it for a much lower price with lesser number of GPUs, and it has a different kind of response model, and most importantly, I think there was a question of export controls, right? How was it that China was able to develop compute capacity for a model like this, despite the existence of those restrictions? And more recently in the news is the development that Alibaba's Ant R has been able to reportedly train AI in the country using China-made semiconductors. Now, a lot of that should be taken with a grain of salt. We saw a similar story come about with Huawei's Mate Pro 60, when it was expected that, the 7 nanometer chip that went into the device was China-made, but it turned out to just be a stockpile from Taiwan from back in time. So maybe you could share your thoughts on why is it that DeepSeek has been this disruptive? What makes it so interesting, and maybe a cause of worry for some, and any other thoughts that you may have on these developments?
Yeah. So I think DeepSeek is newsworthy for two reasons, right? Firstly, obviously, the fact that it came from China. I think prior to DeepSeek's release, particularly the R1 model, if you had asked an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley in the US where they thought China was perhaps in the AI race, vis-a-vis the US, they would have told you 6 to 9 months. And in a technology like AI, 6 to 9 months is a lot, given how quickly things were progressing and just how quickly the advancements were being made. But now we know with the R1 model that maybe the gap is just about 3 months, right? And that's, again, the closing of the gap being very, very fast.
Yeah.
And secondly, DeepSeek did this in a way that was open source, right? Very, very generous licenses to use, copy, distribute, modify, and so on, right? So very transparent, very generous licenses. Without these two, I think this news story wouldn't have been this newsworthy.
Right.
Particularly, open source is important because if not for that, global developers might not have been able to try it for themselves and attest to the fact that this really is this good.
Yeah.
I think we should look at the price a little bit with a pinch of salt, because the final 5 million or 6 million that was reported was for the final training run. It's not necessarily for the entire training of the model. It's not necessarily for the complete funding that went into DeepSeek from the hedge fund High Flyer that completely owns it. And obviously it doesn't involve talent and compute and other kinds of costs, right? So I think we should take the price with a pinch of salt, because when you say OpenAI and others have $1 billion in funding and this is 5 to 6 million, we're definitely not comparing likes for likes. So I think with that, regardless, this is important because the fact that they were able to do this and they're able to offer it pretty much at cost, which is way magnitudes smaller than their Western companies, is something to look at, right? And obviously they have done a bunch of very technical inferences and very technical improvisations which have allowed for this to happen, right? So it's worked really smartly, which is not to say that this is all just a gimmick. I mean, if that was the case, multiple other countries in the world could have done it, but clearly not, right? I mean, this takes engineering, this takes technical talent, and this takes committed technical talent over a long period of time to be able to do this. And we know that's true, particularly of DeepSeek, right? And the environment that it is inside of China. So I think that is where DeepSeek really lies in the context of all of this. Coming to export controls particularly, again, there's evidence to show that High Flyer, which again was very AI first in its operations, and this is a hedge fund which uses algorithmic trading, since 2015, they've been kind of looking at AI in their data scraping, data processing, and their AI models and their operations. So it's been a while, right? And we know for a fact that they've also been stockpiling way before some of these export controls even came into effect, right? So again, whether or not this was able to bypass export controls is another, but clearly they had a need to do that. They had a need to innovate with lower quality chips, lower advanced chips, because DeepSeek was finally trained on lower advanced chips than, say, the latest model of NVIDIA, right? So which just tell you that they did have a need to kind of innovate and come up with smarter ways to do this. which I think is so impressive, and which is kind of reason for Deepseek to kind of make global headwinds.
Yeah, but it also then tells you that maybe in the next 5 years, the restrictions may actually bring about serious challenges to innovation when the shortfalls really become severe, right?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, it waits to be seen where this ecosystem overall is headed, right? Because traditionally, if you think about since the 1980s when China opened up with their economic reforms, one thing that it really benefited from was international linkages. It benefited from free flow of people, capital, ideas, research, technology transfers, everything, right? So we had Chinese going abroad, we had foreigners coming to China, we had increasing FDI flows into China, we had increasing joint ventures because China was a large market, right? So the Chinese government was able to trade market for technology, as it were, with foreign firms. And then, of course, we also know that they were able to not just manipulate some of these technology transfers, but sometimes just outright steal them as well. And over time, they've gotten so much better in some of these advancements over time. So it waits to be seen with just the geopolitical tensions right now, the broader decoupling with China, at least the attempt. I mean, today the attempt is not very cohesive, because if you see for particularly some quantum technology hardware, some semiconductor manufacturing equipments, we see that the export controls are not necessarily cohesive between the US and multiple countries in Europe. Right? So unless that cohesion happens and the technical standards and the technical things are kind of laid out very clearly, China will continue to surpass multiple export controls and stockpile, right? So it waits to be seen where the effectiveness of some of these will be. And it also waits to be seen whether or not China would, I mean, there's two ways to look at it, right? One is that China today has the critical mass in multiple technology areas to be able to now advance completely independently. The other is that because they benefited from international linkages, the absence of that is going to hurt China more than ever. And coupled with the macroeconomic situation in China and so on, whether or not China would be able to stand up in the next few years. So that's the tussle, I think, for where this ecosystem is headed.
Interesting. And there goes my final question, Shobhankita, because I wanted to understand from you, with persisting tensions and contestation with the US and some of its other allies, maybe not so much allies now, but erstwhile friends, can a cohesive and continued backlash against China stifle innovation? And it turns out maybe some of these restrictions can really be effective in the coming years, because adversaries innovate too, and ultimately it becomes competition in that sense. But I think skills training, talent cultivation, all of these are equally important components of China's overall tech strategy, and I think that could really pull the weight of the second largest economy in the world if it comes to it. Any final thoughts?
Just two examples where these have not worked in the Chinese context alone, right? So I think about 10 years ago or so, Europe had import controls on solar panels from China. And the reason was, they were anti-subsidies, they were anti-dumping, and so they said, we want to protect our in-house domestic industry. And between 2022 to 2023, as compared to say 8-9 years ago, it's barely marked a dent. The fact that Europe had import controls. If you look at Chinese prevalence in these industries inside of Europe, it really has not made a dent, right? I mean, barely about 7 to 8%, which is a lot of work for very little. So again, it has not worked in this particular context, at least. Secondly, in 2000s, Bill Clinton had actually said this, and this was prior to China joining WTO. And he had said, the entire idea of a firewall, which China was, again, among the first countries to pioneer the idea of digital sovereignty, right? That a nation must not just protect its territorial borders, but also its internet and digital borders. And so the state should be able to control that. And, to that effect, China had the Great Firewall, and many of their domestic tech kind of, got that protection. I mean, not to say that they're not good. I mean, they're very, very good despite that. But the fact is that they wouldn't have the curtailing of global internet and global apps, global social media for Chinese consumers wouldn't have worked if not for Chinese apps being this good. But regardless, Bill Clinton actually had said, this is China trying to stick jello to a wall, that this is something that cannot happen. And we know for a fact that China was able to do this, right?
Yeah.
So this is an economy that, despite multiple people thinking that this is perhaps terrible ideas, Great Firewall, closing off your economy and export controls and so on, and import controls as we saw with Europe.
The EU, yeah.
We see that
it's thrived.
it's thrived since.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, this is something which makes, I think, tracking this ecosystem so much more fun, because it's full of nuances, it's full of complexities. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff, Shobhankita. I think that certainly tempers a lot of expectations, moderates them a little bit, because there is an economic slowdown. There is the need to revitalize private sentiment. There is a need to manage SOEs, local government debts, so on and so forth. And yet, we have significant examples from history, and not just ancient history, but more recent past as well, that China has found itself able to innovate under harsh conditions and global restrictions, right? So it remains to be seen how much more effective can some of these restrictions become over the next few years as the technological competition intensifies. But till such a time, I guess it would be lovely to revisit this conversation a couple months down the road. And thank you so much, Shobhankita, for all the insights you shared, all the interesting work that you do as part of Technopolitic. I encourage our listeners to subscribe to the newsletter, to follow China Tech on a regular basis. And if you have any thoughts, if you agree or disagree, if you have brickbats or praises, tell us in the comments below. Thank you, and lovely seeing you again as part of All Things Policy.
Thank you. Thank you.